There are two types of neighbors in this world. The ones who wave at you from across the street and occasionally lend you a cup of sugar, and the ones who steal your snow shovel and act like they've done you a favor. Jack had the misfortune of living next to the latter. It wasn't just any snow shovel, it was his snow shovel. Bright red, ergonomic, and sturdy enough to survive an apocalypse. And Karen? Karen was the kind of neighbor who could turn a simple act of shoveling snow into a neighborhood Cold War. It all started on a bitterly cold Saturday morning. Jack, a man of simple pleasures and an undying commitment to suburban order, had just finished clearing his driveway after an overnight blizzard. The snow was piled high, but Jack tackled it with the precision of a man who had spent years perfecting his craft. His driveway gleamed like freshly polished marble, a testament to his dedication and his trusty shovel. Jack leaned on the shovel for a moment, admiring his handiwork, before heading inside to warm up with a cup of coffee. Little did he know, as he sipped his brew and basked in his small victory over nature, Karen was plotting her next move. And by plotting, I mean she was casually strolling over to Jack's driveway to steal his shovel as if it were her birthright. When Jack glanced out the window later that afternoon, he nearly dropped his coffee mug. There she was, Karen, the self-proclaimed dictator of their homeowners association, HOA, wielding his shovel like some kind of suburban Thor. She wasn't just borrowing it. She was using it with the confidence of someone who thought possession was 9/10 of the law. At first, Jack tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Surely this was some kind of misunderstanding? Maybe Karen had mistaken his shovel for her own? But as he watched her toss snow over her shoulder with all the grace and entitlement of a monarch surveying her kingdom, Jack realized there was no mistake. Karen had stolen his shovel, and she wasn't even trying to hide it. Jack stared out the window for a long moment, debating his options. Should he confront her immediately? Call the police? Write an angry post on Nextdoor? He decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps she'd return it once she finished shoveling her driveway. After all, what kind of person would just keep something they'd blatantly stolen? By sunset, it became clear that Karen was exactly that kind of person. The next morning, Jack woke up early and checked outside. His driveway was still clear, his hard work from the day before holding strong, but Karen's driveway now looked immaculate as well. And there, leaning against her garage door like a trophy on display, was his beloved red shovel. That was it. Jack had had enough. Fueled by caffeine and righteous indignation, Jack marched over to Karen's house. He rang the doorbell with more force than necessary and waited as frost formed on his breath in the icy air. Karen opened the door wearing a smug expression that immediately set Jack's teeth on edge. "Oh, hi Jack," she said sweetly, though her tone carried all the warmth of a DMV clerk on their third double shift. "Morning, Karen," Jack began, forcing himself to remain calm. "I couldn't help but notice that you've got my snow shovel." Karen tilted her head in faux confusion. "Your snow shovel?" she repeated slowly, as if testing out foreign words for the first time. "Yes," Jack said firmly, "the red one leaning against your garage door." "Oh," Karen said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I found that lying around yesterday." Jack blinked in disbelief. "You found it lying around?" "It was on my driveway." "Well," Karen replied with a shrug, "you weren't using it at the time." Jack felt his blood pressure spike dangerously high. "Karen," he said through gritted teeth, "that doesn't mean you can just take it." Karen crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe with all the casual arrogance of someone who believed they were untouchable. "Look, Jack," she said condescendingly, "as HOA president, I have to ensure that resources are used efficiently in this community. If you're not actively using something, it only makes sense for someone else to borrow it." "Borrow?" Jack repeated incredulously. "You didn't ask me. You just took it." Karen gave him a tight-lipped smile that could have been mistaken for polite if not for its underlying smugness. "Well," she said breezily, "if you want it back so badly, maybe you should put your name on it next time." Jack stared at her for a moment, struggling to process what he just heard. Was this real life? Was he actually being lectured about labeling his own property by someone who had stolen it? "Karen," he said slowly, trying one last time to appeal to reason. "Just give me back my shovel." Karen's smile widened into something truly infuriating. A smirk so obnoxious it could probably be used as evidence in court. "Sorry," she said lightly before shutting the door in his face. Jack stood there for several seconds, staring at the closed door as if willing it to reopen through sheer force of will. When it didn't budge, he turned and trudged back home through the snow, muttering curses under his breath. That evening, still seething from his encounter with Karen, Jack decided to review footage from his security camera. Sure enough, there she was, clear as day, marching onto his property and making off with his shovel like some kind of suburban bandit. Armed with this evidence, Jack filed a formal complaint with the HOA board at their next meeting. Surely they wouldn't condone such blatant theft, but when he presented his case, complete with video proof, Karen dismissed him with an exaggerated sigh. "This is hardly worth our time," she declared as if discussing a minor inconvenience rather than grand larceny. "But she stole my shovel," Jack protested. "Borrowed?" Karen corrected with an air of faux innocence. The other board members exchanged awkward glances but ultimately sided with Karen because, let's face it, no one wanted to get on her bad side. Defeated but not deterred, Jack returned home that night feeling more determined than ever. This wasn't just about a snow shovel anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. As he sat by the window sipping hot cocoa and staring out at Karen's house glowing smugly under its Christmas lights, an idea began to form in his mind. And thus began Jack's journey into petty revenge. A journey fueled by principle and perfected by sheer spite. Jack didn't wake up the next morning thinking, "Today's the day I become a petty vigilante." But as he sat at his kitchen table, staring out the window at Karen's driveway, now pristine thanks to his snow shovel, he felt a strange sense of purpose brewing. It wasn't just about the shovel anymore. No, this was about justice, about principle, about teaching Karen that there were consequences for her tyrannical reign over the neighborhood. And if the HOA wasn't going to do anything about it, then Jack would. He started small. After all, revenge is an art form, and every masterpiece begins with a sketch. His first move was subtle, almost imperceptible, a test of Karen's patience. That afternoon, Jack took a walk around the neighborhood with a pocketful of birdseed. As he passed Karen's house, he casually sprinkled the seeds along her perfectly shoveled driveway and front yard. By dawn the next day, her property had become the hottest brunch spot for every pigeon, crow, and seagull within a 5-mile radius. Karen was livid. Jack watched from his living room window as she stormed outside in her bathrobe, flailing her arms at the feathery intruders like a deranged scarecrow. She even called animal control, but they informed her that birds on private property weren't exactly their jurisdiction. Jack sipped his coffee with a satisfied smirk. But this was only the beginning. The next phase of Jack's plan required a bit more creativity and some help from Amazon Prime. Over the course of a week, he ordered an assortment of items. Glitter bombs disguised as greeting cards, fake HOA violation notices printed on official-looking letterhead, and a motion-activated sprinkler system that he installed on his own property but angled just so toward Karen's driveway. The glitter bomb was the first to strike. It arrived in Karen's mailbox one sunny afternoon, cleverly disguised as a thank you card from a fictitious neighbor named Linda. Karen opened it on her porch, and within seconds she was covered in enough glitter to make a Vegas showgirl jealous. Jack could hear her shrieking from inside his house. The fake HOA notices were next. Jack slipped them into Karen's mailbox under the cover of darkness. The first one cited her for excessive smugness and demanded she remove all mirrors from her home to comply with neighborhood humility standards. The second accused her of violating an obscure zoning law by having too many opinions per square foot. Each notice was signed by the Neighborhood Oversight Committee, which Jack thought sounded official enough to be believable but ridiculous enough to drive Karen mad. And then there was the sprinkler system, a true work of genius. Every time Karen stepped onto her driveway to retrieve her mail or yell at passing children for riding their bikes too fast, the sprinklers would activate with military precision, soaking her from head to toe in icy water. Jack had programmed them to turn off after 15 seconds to avoid suspicion, but it was enough to leave Karen fuming and damp. By this point, word of Jack's antics had begun to spread through the neighborhood. His fellow residents, many of whom had suffered under Karen's iron-fisted rule, started cheering him on from afar. Mrs. Henderson from 2 houses down baked him cookies as a token of gratitude. Mr. Patel offered to lend him his drone for reconnaissance purposes. Even the mailman gave him a knowing nod one morning as he delivered another package of glitter bombs. But Jack wasn't doing this for fame or glory. He was doing it for all the little guys who had ever been wronged by someone like Karen. Of course, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. She filed yet another complaint with the HOA, this time accusing Jack of harassment, but without any concrete evidence. Her claims fell flat. She even tried confronting him directly one afternoon while he was mowing his lawn. "Jack!" she barked from across the street, marching toward him like an angry chihuahua in designer loafers. Jack turned off his mower and leaned casually against it. "Karen," he said with an exaggerated smile. "What can I do for you? You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed, jabbing a finger in his direction. Jack feigned innocence. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Karen narrowed her eyes. "The birds? The glitter? The sprinklers? Don't play dumb with me." "Karen," Jack said with mock sincerity, "if you're having issues with your property, I suggest filing a complaint with the HOA. Karen let out an exasperated growl before storming back to her house. Jack waited until she was out of earshot before allowing himself a small chuckle. But even as he reveled in his victories, Jack knew that this battle wasn't over yet. Karen was stubborn, perhaps even more stubborn than he was, and she wouldn't rest until she regained control of their suburban fiefdom. So Jack decided it was time to escalate. Late one night, armed with nothing but a garden hose and an unshakable sense of pettiness, Jack began constructing his piece de resistance, an ice wall. Using the freezing temperatures to his advantage, he sprayed layer after layer of water along the edge of Karen's property line until it formed a towering barrier of solid ice. By dawn, the wall stood over 15 feet tall, a glistening monument to passive-aggressive vengeance. When Karen woke up that morning and saw what had been built overnight, she nearly fainted on her front porch. She called every number she could think of: the HOA hotline, which went straight to voicemail, the local police department, who told her it wasn't illegal, even her cousin who worked in construction, who laughed so hard he hung up on her. Jack watched from his window as Karen paced back and forth in front of the ice wall like a caged tiger. For once in her life, she seemed at a loss for words, and for Jack that was victory enough. As he sat back in his recliner with another cup of coffee, basking in the glow of his triumph, Jack couldn't help but feel proud of what he'd accomplished. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every neighbor who had ever been bullied by someone like Karen. And as far as Jack was concerned, justice had never tasted sweeter or looked shinier under the morning sun reflecting off 15 feet of solid ice. Jack had always considered himself a reasonable man. He paid his taxes, watered his lawn, and even attended the occasional HOA meeting, despite the fact that listening to Karen drone on about community standards felt like a punishment reserved for the ninth circle of hell. But as he sat in his living room, watching Karen pace back and forth in front of the 15-foot ice wall he'd built around her house, Jack realized that reason had officially left the building, and he was perfectly fine with that. Karen, predictably, was losing her mind. She had spent the better part of the morning calling every authority she could think of. The HOA? They were useless. The police? They told her it was a civil matter. The fire department? They laughed and suggested she invest in an ice pick. Even her lawyer, who she'd called in a fit of desperation, had informed her that there was no legal precedent for being trapped by an ice wall built by your neighbor. Jack watched all of this unfold from his window with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for lottery winners and people who find $20 in their coat pocket. He wasn't proud of himself, not exactly, but he wasn't ashamed either. Karen had pushed him too far, and if she thought she could bully him into submission, she was about to learn a very cold lesson. By noon, Karen had resorted to yelling at passersby from her front porch, hoping someone would take pity on her and help dismantle the wall. But Jack had planned for this. The ice wall wasn't just tall. It was strategically reinforced with layers of frozen snow and water, making it nearly impossible to break without heavy machinery. And since Karen's driveway was still blocked by the sprinklers Jack had installed earlier, there was no way for a truck or crane to get close enough to help. "Jack!" Karen screamed at one point, her voice cracking with frustration. "You can't do this. It's illegal." Jack opened his window just enough to reply. "Actually, Karen," he said cheerfully, "I checked with my lawyer before I built it. Turns out there's no law against building an ice wall on your own property." Karen looked like she might explode. "This isn't over," she shrieked before storming back inside. Jack closed the window and chuckled to himself. He knew Karen well enough to know that she wouldn't give up easily, but he also knew that he had the upper hand. For once in their long and contentious history, Jack was in control, and it felt amazing. Over the next few days, Karen tried everything she could think of to dismantle the wall. She hired a handyman to chip away at it with a hammer and chisel, but after 3 hours of work, he'd barely made a dent, and Karen refused to pay him for his lack of results. She rented a space heater from Home Depot and aimed it at the wall, but all it did was create a small puddle that refroze overnight. She even tried salting the base of the wall, but Jack had anticipated this and built it on top of a layer of gravel to prevent erosion. Meanwhile, Jack went about his life as if nothing was out of the ordinary. He shoveled his driveway, using his shovel, waved at neighbors who gave him thumbs up as they passed by, and even baked cookies for Mrs. Henderson as a thank you for her moral support during this whole ordeal. Every time he saw Karen struggling with the wall, or yelling at someone about how unfair it all was, he felt a little pang of guilt. But then he remembered all the times she'd made his life miserable. The passive-aggressive emails about his lawn height, the HOA fines for leaving his trash cans out 5 minutes too long, and, of course, the shovel incident. No, Karen deserved this. By day 4, Karen's desperation reached new heights. She called another emergency HOA meeting, this time inviting every resident in the neighborhood in hopes of rallying them against Jack's tyranny. Jack decided to attend, not because he cared what Karen had to say, but because he wanted to see how far she'd go to paint herself as the victim. The meeting took place in Karen's living room, which now felt more like a bunker thanks to the ice wall blocking every window. As Jack walked in, he noticed several neighbors exchanging amused glances, clearly enjoying Karen's meltdown as much as he was. "Thank you all for coming," Karen began with forced politeness that barely masked her fury. "As you're all aware, our community has been under siege by one individual who thinks he's above our rules." Jack raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "This ice wall," Karen continued dramatically, gesturing toward one of her blocked windows, "is not just an attack on me, it's an attack on all of us. It violates everything our HOA stands for: unity, cooperation, and mutual respect." Mrs. Henderson coughed loudly into her hand, a cough that sounded suspiciously like laughter. "I demand," Karen said, slamming her fist on the table for emphasis, "that we take immediate action to remove this monstrosity and hold Jack accountable for his behavior." The room fell silent for a moment before Mr. Patel spoke up from the back corner. "Karen," he said slowly, "didn't you steal Jack's shovel?" Karen turned bright red but quickly recovered. "I borrowed it," she snapped. "And besides, that's irrelevant." "It doesn't seem irrelevant," Mrs. Henderson chimed in sweetly. "In fact, it seems like this whole thing started because you couldn't keep your hands off other people's property." Several neighbors nodded in agreement. Karen looked around the room in disbelief. "Are you seriously taking his side?" she asked incredulously. "Well," Mr. Patel said with a shrug, "he hasn't stolen anything from me, and honestly, that ice wall is kind of impressive." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement as Karen's face twisted into an expression somewhere between rage and despair. Jack decided it was time to speak up. He stood slowly and cleared his throat before addressing the group. "Look," he said calmly, "I didn't build that wall out of malice. I built it because I needed to make a point. Actions have consequences." Karen scoffed loudly but didn't interrupt. "For years," Jack continued, Karen has treated this neighborhood like her personal kingdom, issuing fines for minor infractions, sending passive-aggressive emails about things no one cares about, and yes, stealing my shovel." Several neighbors nodded again. "So if anyone here thinks I'm out of line," Jack concluded with a small smile, "feel free to tell me, but personally, I think this community could use fewer walls and more accountability." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't awkward, it was thoughtful. Karen opened her mouth as if to argue but quickly closed it when she realized no one was backing her up. Jack sat back down feeling more satisfied than ever. Not because he'd won, but because he'd finally stood up for himself, and for everyone else who'd ever been bullied by someone like Karen. Jack didn't expect the HOA meeting to end in his favor. In fact, he had walked into Karen's living room prepared for the worst. A formal reprimand, a fine, maybe even a forced apology. But as he sat there watching Karen's increasingly desperate attempts to rally the neighborhood against him, he realized something profound. Karen had finally overplayed her hand. Years of micromanaging, petty fines, and unsolicited critiques of everyone's landscaping choices had turned her into the neighborhood villain. And now, her ice wall predicament was the final straw. The meeting ended with Karen storming out of her own living room, muttering about ungrateful neighbors and legal action. Jack stayed behind for a few minutes, chatting with Mrs. Henderson about her cookie recipe and accepting congratulations from Mr. Patel for his engineering marvel. It was surreal. Jack had gone from being just another victim of Karen's tyranny to the unofficial hero of the neighborhood. And while he wasn't one to bask in glory, he couldn't help but enjoy the moment. But Karen wasn't done yet. The next morning, Jack woke up to find a letter taped to his front door. It was written in Karen's unmistakable handwriting, loopy cursive that somehow managed to look both elegant and hostile at the same time. The letter was 3 pages long and filled with legal jargon that Karen had clearly Googled in a fit of rage. She accused Jack of malicious intent, property interference, and his personal favorite, emotional distress caused by excessive cold exposure. She demanded that he remove the ice wall immediately or face legal consequences. Jack read the letter twice before bursting into laughter. Emotional distress? Excessive cold exposure? It sounded like Karen was trying to sue winter itself. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer labeled Karen's Greatest Hits, right next to the HOA violation notice she'd sent him last year for having an overly festive Halloween display. By this point, Jack knew better than to take Karen's threats seriously. She loved throwing around words like lawsuit and litigation, but she had never actually followed through on any of it. Still, Jack decided it was time to bring in reinforcements just in case. That afternoon, he called his friend Dave, who happened to be a lawyer specializing in property disputes. Dave was one of those guys who could make even the most mundane legal issues sound fascinating. And Jack knew he'd jump at the chance to take on someone like Karen. "Let me get this straight," Dave said after Jack explained the situation over coffee. "She stole your shovel, you built an ice wall around her house, and now she's threatening to sue you for emotional distress?" "Pretty much," Jack replied. Dave leaned back in his chair, grinning like a kid who'd just been handed a box of fireworks. "This is going to be fun." Over the next few days, Dave helped Jack draft a response to Karen's letter, a masterpiece of legalese that politely but firmly dismantled every one of her claims. It included references to property law, zoning regulations, and even a footnote about how winter weather conditions were not under Jack's control. Jack delivered the letter to Karen's mailbox with a sense of satisfaction that rivaled the day he built the ice wall. Karen's reaction was predictably dramatic. She spent hours pacing in front of her house, waving the letter around like it was evidence in a murder trial. At one point, she even tried calling a local news station to report Jack's acts of aggression. But when they asked her if she had any proof beyond her own testimony, she hung up in frustration. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood continued as usual, except now people were openly rooting for Jack. Kids started calling him Iceman and drawing pictures of him battling Karen with snowballs and icicles. Mrs. Henderson baked him another batch of cookies shaped like tiny shovels. Even Mr. Patel offered to help reinforce the ice wall if Karen tried anything drastic. For Jack, it was both hilarious and humbling. He hadn't set out to become a local legend. He just wanted his shovel back. But as he watched Karen flail against her own hubris day after day, he realized that sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms, even if it involves frozen water. By week 2 of the Ice Wall saga, Karen seemed to be running out of steam. Her calls to various authorities had yielded nothing but polite refusals and thinly veiled amusement. Her attempts to dismantle the wall had failed spectacularly, leaving her driveway littered with broken tools and puddles that refroze overnight. And her threats of legal action had been thoroughly neutralized by Dave's airtight response. But then came the twist no one saw coming: an early thaw. One morning, Jack woke up to find that temperatures had risen significantly overnight. The ice wall, which had stood tall and proud for 2 weeks, was now melting at an alarming rate. By noon, it had shrunk from 15 feet to barely 5 feet tall, leaving behind a slushy mess that seeped into Karen's yard. Karen wasted no time celebrating her apparent victory. She stepped onto her porch with an air of triumph and began shouting at anyone who would listen about how nature had sided with her against Jack's tyranny. "See?" she yelled at Mrs. Henderson as she walked by with her dog. "I told you this wall wouldn't last. Justice always prevails." Mrs. Henderson rolled her eyes but said nothing. Jack watched from his window as Karen strutted around like a peacock who'd just won best in show. He could have been annoyed or even angry, but instead he felt something unexpected: relief. The ice wall had served its purpose. It had forced Karen to confront her own behavior, rallied the neighborhood against her antics, and given Jack a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. And now that it was melting away naturally, there would be no need for further confrontation or escalation. As Karen continued her victory lap around the neighborhood, Jack grabbed his shovel, the same shovel that had started this whole mess, and headed outside to clear his driveway one last time before spring arrived. He worked quietly but efficiently, savoring the crisp air and the satisfying crunch of snow underfoot. When he finished, he leaned on his shovel for a moment and looked over at Karen's house. The ice wall was almost completely gone now, just a few stubborn chunks clinging to life under the afternoon sun. But as far as Jack was concerned, its legacy would live on forever. With a small smile, Jack turned back toward his house and went inside, ready for whatever came next, but content in knowing that sometimes revenge isn't about winning. It's about standing up for yourself, and maybe having a little fun along the way. Jack stood in his driveway, surveying the remnants of the ice wall that had once towered over Karen's property like a frozen fortress. The sun was shining brightly, and the last stubborn chunks of ice were slowly melting away, leaving behind a slushy puddle that would soon be nothing more than a memory. He couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Who would have thought that a simple snow shovel could lead to such an epic showdown? As he cleared away the last bits of snow, Jack felt a sense of satisfaction wash over him. He had stood up to Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, and emerged victorious. The neighborhood was buzzing with stories of his ice wall, and he had become something of a local legend. Kids were drawing pictures of him as the Iceman, and even the adults were starting to see him as a hero of sorts. But as the ice melted, so too did the tension in the neighborhood. Karen, for all her bluster, had been forced to confront her own behavior. She had spent years terrorizing her neighbors with her petty rules and regulations. But now, with the ice wall gone, she was left to face the consequences of her actions. Jack watched as she emerged from her house, her hair disheveled and her expression a mix of defeat and determination. She looked around at the neighborhood, at the people who had once feared her, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment she would change. "Jack," she called out, her voice shaky but loud enough to catch his attention. "Can we talk?" Jack raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect. "Sure, Karen. What's on your mind?" "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been a terrible neighbor, and I realize that now. I let my position as HOA president go to my head." Jack was taken aback. Was this really happening? Was Karen actually apologizing? He nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. "I appreciate that, Karen. Takes a lot to admit when you're wrong. Maybe we can start over? She suggested, her eyes hopeful. I could use some help with my garden this spring. I've never been good at it. Jack couldn't help but smile. I'd be happy to help. Just promise me you'll keep your hands off my shovel. They both laughed, and in that moment, the ice wall melted away not just physically but metaphorically as well. The neighborhood was changing, and perhaps Karen was finally ready to be a part of it. As the days turned into weeks, Jack and Karen began to rebuild their relationship. They worked together on community projects, planting flowers in the park, organizing a neighborhood cleanup day, and slowly but surely, the tension that had once defined their interactions began to dissipate. Karen even started attending HOA meetings with less of an iron fist and more of an open mind. The neighborhood was thriving in ways it hadn't before. People who had once avoided each other now stopped to chat on their morning walks. Kids played together without fear of being scolded for riding their bikes too fast or stepping on someone's lawn. And Jack felt a sense of pride in knowing that he had played a part in this transformation. One sunny afternoon, as Jack sat on his porch sipping lemonade and watching life unfold around him, Karen walked over carrying a plate of cookies. "These are for you," she said with an awkward smile. To say thank you, Jack took the plate and inspected one of the cookies, a perfectly baked chocolate chip masterpiece. "Thank you for what?" he asked. "For not giving up on me," Karen admitted quietly, "and for showing me that sometimes I need to let go." Jack nodded thoughtfully before taking a bite out of one of the cookies. It was delicious, almost as good as Mrs. Henderson's. "Well," he said after swallowing his bite, "if you ever need another ice wall built, don't call me." Karen laughed, a genuine laugh that made Jack realize just how far they'd come. And so life went on in their little corner of suburbia, quieter now but better in so many ways. Jack still kept his shovel close by just in case, but he no longer felt like he needed it as a weapon in some ongoing battle for survival. Because sometimes revenge isn't about getting even. It's about standing up for what's right and finding a way to move forward together. So if you've enjoyed Jack's story of ice walls and neighborhood drama, don't forget to like this post. Share it with your friends who might need some inspiration for dealing with their own Karens.